Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, welcome to 2023. I was planning to post this episode last week between Christmas and New Year, but circumstances precluded. Namely, I finally got pasted with COVID. It was my own fault, although it was abetted by the out-of-town client who wanted to meet with me for lunch in an insanely crowded tourist restaurant in New York City 4 days before Christmas. I should have known better, but regardless, there we are. Within 48 hours, I was feeling like crap. Positive test on Christmas Eve once the fever showed up. So that sucked in general. I'm better now, except for some heavy congestion, which you can sort of hear. But the overall walloping that I took, combined with the contagiousness window, really knocked out my plans for that week between Christmas and New Year. I was going to do 2 in-person shows, 1 remote, visit the Hopper exhibition at the Whitney. All of that was off the board. What was weird was when I had to contact one of the guests to reschedule, and they were just super solicitous about my health and told me not to worry about the podcast. Don't worry, we'll get to it sometime, but it's more important that I rest and recover. And I say that's weird because it's what I've been saying to other people for the last 2 to 3 years. Anytime shows had to get bumped because somebody tests positive, whether it's a remote or in person, I'm always the solicitous and understanding and don't worry, we'll figure it out. And it's weird being on the other side of that. I'll be honest. I appreciate it. But yeah, being the guy who has to accept other people's care and solicitousness instead of being the giving guy, well, that's something for me. The most important thing throughout this whole experience is that my wife has managed to test negative throughout this, even though we have taken virtually no measures to prevent her getting it. Like when I first came up positive that Saturday before Christmas, I put on a mask, was about to move downstairs, and her take was, she's already been around me for 2+ days. She's likely been exposed already, so no point in masking up around the house, etc. Somehow, again, she's turned up negative. All hail the vaccines. It's a wonder. It's either that or her alien physiology, whatever it is. Something helped her out on this one, and she does not have COVID while I do. So that's how it's working out. But like I said, a bunch of my podcast plans got derailed, which means January is going to be a bit more helter-skelter than I'd hoped. But I do have the next 2 scheduled and a bunch more tentative ones. Which brings me to this thing. See, during the period of isolation over the last week and seeing my best laid plans get blown up, combined with the end of year summation of one's life vibe and the fact that a couple of shows I was going to record in a week or 2 before Christmas had to get bumped because of COVID scares on the other side, and I hadn't recorded with anybody since Stephen Heller in early December. I was kind of considering all options. We'll put it that way. I got to wondering how or whether I should change the podcast going forward. I was kind of racked with self-doubt and, sort of telling myself I'd been half-assing my way through things for the past few months or going through the motions in certain ways. I don't know if it's true or not, but, really felt accurate in the downward spiral I was on a few days into pandemia. So, I looked at putting the podcast on hiatus for a month or 2 after this one, or going to a less frequent schedule. And I thought about more drastic stuff, too. I guess things really sort of got to me. And I found myself for a little while unable to access the joy of doing the show. I'll put it that way. Like, I remembered good moments that I'd had, but wasn't able to access the emotions that came with those. And that had me worried, I guess. Told me I was going in the wrong direction. But I got some rest, cleared my head, didn't make any pronunciamentos or grand decisions or anything before then. And then a guest who I'd pitched a few days earlier for January wrote to say they'd love to come on the show again. And I thought, well, I can't let them down. So it meant, I was back on. And I went to the great spreadsheet that knows all, and I saw all the weeks filled up going into April as I'd planned out from November onwards. And I thought, Gil, maybe you overplanned a little this year, and maybe that's what's kind of freaking you out, that you've got everything locked in and kind of structured, and you need to build in some slack and let things go, because the world just walloped the shit out of you for a week. You take that as a lesson. Don't try and over prepare here. Figure things out a little more and build in some flexibility. So, there are a couple of changes I am thinking of making going forward with the show. Same format, etc. Nothing major is going to change. But I worked way too hard over the years to line up certain episodes with their subjects, pub dates for their books or projects. And I might try to be more flexible about that in future. Maybe some episodes will come out a week or 2 or 3 or a month after the book comes out. I can't get every single guest accommodated like that. Sometimes it's timing. There's other things that go on. Sometimes 3 guests have a project coming out at the same time. Whatever it is, I'm going to maybe let off the pedal with that a bit. The other thing I'm more curious about is, and it's something that Fink, the person who interviews me this episode, was going to ask right at the beginning, the amount of repeat guests I've had has sort of creeped up over the years, each year. And it's a natural thing. As I've recorded with more people, they have new projects over the years and come back on the show. But at the same time, I wonder if subconsciously I treat repeat guests as a sort of, I can take this easier, like not have to do so much research or heavy lifting because I've already had the big conversation with them. Now we can riff a bit more, just work on the current project, whatever it is. And I wonder if that starts to spill over into some of the new guests where maybe I'm not prepping as well as I should. So I may try and cut back on repeat guests going forward. And as ever, I will try to do better with more guests who are women and or people of color. Last year was particularly bad for those ratios of anything but white males. But anyway, I came out of that COVID-aided spiral of year-end self-doubt kind of charged up for this year. So let's get to this week's show and kick off 2023. So this is the second annual Aaron Finkelstein Interviews Gil Roth episode of the podcast, which is why I planned to post it last week, because we did the first one at the very end of 2021, where Aaron and I recorded a session where I was the guest for once. And it was bizarrely well received. It was sort of a one-off idea originally, but people fucking loved this one. And we decided to give it another shot. The one thing it reminds me of is another 2022 episode, one I did with the therapist Andrew Jameson around his book, Midlife, where I thought I did way too much talking, but listeners just kept writing me about how much they enjoyed my being open about some of my life and having a real sort of honest interaction with Andrew like it was a therapy session. So anyway, this is our second go-round, me and Finkelstein, or Fink as I know him. Unfortunately, this time around, we recorded on the 27th, so I was 3 or 4 days into COVID, and Aaron is still recovering from his first bout with it. So neither of us are at our best. We'll just put it that way. It's a strange talk. I'll just leave it at that, and you're going to hear it in just a minute. Nothing much else to tell you. I've known Aaron since my first experience at St. John's College in Annapolis in the summer of 1992. I went down to St. John's for the summer to study Attic Greek for 6 weeks and just get in the whole vibe. And then starting in the fall of 93 is when I began the graduate program there. Anyway, I met Aaron during that first stretch in summer of 92. I talked about our relationship last year. Aaron is still the person who thinks most like me, which freaks both of us out for different reasons. But anyway, the reason why he's the guy interviewing me is because he knows how I think, or thinks like I think, even though we have very, very different lives. So, as caveats go, his mic was kind of low, and there's a few clipping events in there where it kind of, you'll hear the volume sort of maxes out for a moment. And there's a 20-minute segment I cut because it was a really boring tirade I started about superhero movies. Led us both down some conversational dead ends. And we decided afterwards, that can go. So here's Aaron's bio. Aaron Finkelstein is a writer, sound designer, and musician living in Seattle, Washington. He has, for more than a decade, played the role of trickster uncle to his young nephews, Kai and Kenji. He teaches them board games, iambic pentameter, pop music trivia, comic strip history, theoretical and applied geekery, and the power of the written word. Mr. Finkelstein has held the job titles of Coal Scuttle, Web Monkey, Don Juan's Feckless Tobacconist, Sprinting Cubicle Troglodyte, Copy Flogger, Phonics Monkey, Tritagonist, and the much-maligned Voice of Reason. Currently, he is seeking gainful employment as a Luftmensch, license plate alphabetizer, or color swatch. He no longer accepts appointments as a social creature, stage foot, perhaps man, or peacekeeper. And now, the annual Virtual Memories conversation between Aaron Finkelstein and Gil Roth.
All righty. Well, when last we spoke, we were talking about we dug into sort of the origin story of the Virtual Memories show, and we were talking about returning guests and how interesting it was to actually see them change over the course of what is now years of the existence of the podcast, and it's a chance to really sit down and assess what's changed from the last time we spoke to them. And so I thought that'd be a great place to start here. What has changed since last I spoke to you? It's been a weird year, particularly the last couple of months. I've gone through some transformational periods that I've alluded to, not gone into explicitly because I'm pretty sure it would bore the crap out of everybody. I've told my story one-on-one to a couple of people, but in the process, there's always a concern that you'll kill it with words, or at least that I will. But I've rediscovered, I guess, coincidence, or not the pattern building of the psychotic exactly, but the sense that things are kind of moving around you in neat and semi-mystical ways, I guess, which is all vague. To put it in that boring story that I've tried not to tell on the air, on Yom Kippur, I did the usual fast, 25 hours, no food and water, and it changed from past times about it. The thing I always tell people, I'm not religious. I just like the affliction, and that works for me. And in this case, the affliction opened things up to me on the interior. And I woke up the next morning after this whole fast with the realization that I needed to go out to Columbus, Ohio, to the Cartoon Crossroads Columbus Festival, which was founded by my late friend Tom Spurgeon, who died right before the pandemic, November 2019. And the festival was having its first real in-person event that weekend, the day after this. So it was Thursday morning. I woke up with that understanding, and I just booked a flight, booked a hotel room, and Friday I flew out and went out there, even though a few days after this was my big conference in Maryland for my day job, where I was hosting and doing I'm the only person involved in it, so doing all the planning and preparation and logistics and everything. And
went and kind of had a whole bunch of really good experiences, and kind of the reason I went was because I'd realized in that morning after Yom Kippur that I had never really mourned losing Tom. He died right before the pandemic, and then things got weird, and it hit me that this was this big unresolved thing inside me. And I went out there and I saw his friends and his loved ones and the thing he had created. And I talked to other people. The funny story about this is I met with one of the younger people who helps organize the festival. And he said to me, he named his child after Tom a few months after Tom's death. And he said to me, Gil, I have this feeling like I never really mourned Tom because of everything that's gone on right afterwards. And I said to him, I don't want to say that I'm happy that you're suffering, but I am happy that you're suffering in the exact same way that I'm suffering. So, at least between us, I know it's not just me, that, this is something that matters. And that we didn't get to do. And that maybe having CXC again was something that really, helped keep, extended Tom in time, I suppose. Whatever it was, it that weekend and then some stuff that went on the following weeks kind of got me more at ease. I no longer feel the same longing or sense of loss. I mean, I feel an immense loss at losing my closest friend, but at the same time, I feel as though I've been able to let him go in a certain way. And there's a much longer version of this story that I'm not going to bore you with. I will bore you with off mic later on at some point, but not for the listeners. But it was a start of something that over subsequent weeks, where I had other things go on in my life, travel to London and then Frankfurt for business, sitting down and talking with people and just it's weird. I feel as though, ironically, since I got hit with COVID just a couple of days ago, and that could have ended everything that I feel like I was transforming and opening up into, I feel as though I've transformed and opened up into somebody different. And then I made the mistake of having a business lunch in Bryant Park on December 21st, surrounded by 10 million tourists and getting pasted with COVID 2 days later. But I think the biggest thing has really just been these last few months of coming to see what we put on hold and the necessity of reaching out and not just letting the world kind of keep going without us. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Talk louder.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I'm in reflecting on what you had been talking about. Right after you got your diagnosis, you were noticing that you'd cast off a lot of things that, a lot of distractions, a lot of stuff that was just habitual, a lot of the connection to social media that wasn't particularly meaningful. And it sounds to me also as if some of that space was created in part because of the isolation. It was so much easier to begin to pare down. But you had predicted that you might find yourself reinventing and likely calling in some of those distractions again and starting to build up again from that sort of pure state. So it's interesting to hear you, reflect on this particular.
Yeah,
kind of
I'll say in relation to the post-diagnosis, and diagnosis was like July 21. I still don't look at numbers really. Like I stopped checking my podcast stats except for the day that I log in to upload the new episode. I used to do it all the time. I still look at things like the other big change that I've gone through, or just the weird thing I've done throughout this entire year, which I have 4 days left to do this in. I mail out a postcard every day, and pretty much every day. I have averaged a postcard every day. We'll put it that way, okay? Don't get on my ass about this. Some days I don't send the card, but some days I send 2. Anyway, and I do a little video on YouTube every morning. I started that like 2 months into it, where I would pull the postcard from the box and have a reveal moment and, prattle on a little about myself and my monstrous egotism and vanity. And I look occasionally on YouTube, but those always sit around a dozen or so views. It's not like there's some magic number, except for the Guy Fawkes Day where somehow 110 people watched my 2.5 minutes of talking about a postcard or whatever song was in my head that morning. But really, that stuff's meaningless.
It's got to be some kind of facial hair algorithm, don't you think? I think that's...
You would think. And the days I leave my hair down doesn't have any bearing. Most days it's tied back when I do the video, but either way,
weird.
Doesn't set anything off. And I post those on Mastodon now and Twitter and Instagram, links back to the YouTube clip. But that was the other significant change from when we last spoke for the show, was doing this postcard thing and just the joy of getting mail back from people. The irritating part, of course, is when someone emails me to tell me they got my postcard, because I could have done that a lot easier. But getting cards. One day it was an Argentinian cartoonist, I think, who lives in Scotland. He sent me 3 minis and a postcard. Another postcard correspondent who I met through Twitter or something wrote me, an Australian living in Japan. And another one who's a cartoonist who was working at a Chipotle and now has a library job she's really happy with, wrote me from Chicago. It just happened. All 3 showed up in one day, and I thought, what a goddamn wonder. You send these things out like seeds, and people realize you can slow down and write something and put a stamp on it and send it out and not have to get an instant, got your message or like or something. That, things can take time, and they can show the amount of care that you put into, even if it's something banal, just writing it and going to the effort of mailing it means something. So that's been the other thing for me, and I'll keep doing that in 23. I don't know if I'll do the video stuff ongoing, because it takes up like 10 or 15 minutes every morning, and I could spend that time dicking around on social media. I mean, working on incredibly important things for the podcast or something. But yeah, that's been the other significant change or what's gone on since we last recorded.
Well, I moved house, and
shit. Do I have your new address? Oh, anyway, go on.
Yes, yes. Well, I got the postcard anyway. But a funny thing happened that's got me thinking. There's a funny thing happened. I thought when I moved to my old place, I didn't unpack my books. I felt really temporary in that place. I never got the library fully set up, and I started to acquire fewer books. And I really thought, hey, maybe I'm actually starting to really switch over to digital, that I was finding it easier to read. I knew there was still stuff I wouldn't be able to find in a digital format, but, am I becoming a less physically book focused person and a less book acquisitive person? And when I moved, the first thing I started doing was just opening up boxes of books, and it just completely altered my relationship with written word all over again. Like in this totally cliched way. I've got this stack of books next to my bed now, which is got medieval history, and it's got cheap science fiction paperbacks from when I was a kid. There's a teen novel from 1977 that I think might be where I learned what a crush feels like. I mean, just the bizarre gamut of stuff I'm pulling out of there, and what it's awakening in me is completely different. So its lessons got to be learned over and over again. But again, reconnecting with the stuff that's really concrete and really valuable and really tangible in a way that you think you've outgrown.
It's a weird trip. I mean, as much as you like the dopamine hit of the email coming in or the likes or whatever. Just and I talked about, I had that episode with David Sachs about the return of the digital, or the return of the analog. Things matter in a real world setting. The significance of it. The idea that someone cared, or that you found, remembering where you bought a certain book. In that pre-Amazon world or pre-ABE world, when we'd actually have to hunt down certain books and find them in great used bookstores, or the Brentanos in Somerville where I found, the Recognitions back in 1993, I guess, maybe 92. But anyway, yeah, you know, we're of that world. I think we're, you know, we hold on to those things, or we locate ourselves through, you know, the location of where we found something special instead of, you know, where we clicked on something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, some of these, I was astounded to discover that, you know, one of the books was a book I've actually had since high school. I realized, didn't I read this in high school? And I opened it up, and there's my 1985 era signature in the front, you know, and the period.
No wonder they thought I was a serial killer. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So there's also a re-encountering of the self that's just been boxed up. It's just been invisible to me. And, you know, there's this supposed rule about decluttering. It says, if you can leave something in a box for 6 or 7 years, like I did, well, it clearly must not be that important, but, it was all contained. It was all being stored up in there.
Yeah. I mean, it's a different phenomenon, but and I've told it before. I had Lampedusa's novel, The Leopard, on my shelf for 10 years before I finally opened it. You know, right. I think somebody had mentioned it. I picked it up when I was 30, 31, and then one of my guests, a guy I would end up recording with because of this, Willard Spiegelman, wrote this wonderful piece about The Leopard. And I thought, oh, yeah, I should take that off the shelf. And lo and behold, it's one of my all-time favorite books now. But had I read it 10 years earlier, it also wouldn't have made the same impact. That book for a 30-year-old doesn't mean the same thing as it does for a 41-year-old.
Right. I remember you saying that, last year. Because I was thinking about that with this particular book from high school. It was Darkness at Noon by Arthur Koestler. I haven't thought about it since I read it. And when I read it, it certainly would have been triangulated against Orwell and von Denisovich, probably, as just this other document of totalitarianism, another document of this kind of the intersection of the political and social and whatever. And I just got an urge to read it. I just, I hadn't thought about it, and I read it, and I was stunned what a good novel it is. And I had exactly the same reaction. I thought, why do they assign this to high school kids? The actual human stuff in this that makes it a novel, that makes it a human story, just goes completely over your head when you're 15.
Yeah, well, we happen to go to school during the late stages of the Cold War, so we kind of need to factor that in also.
That is fair. Yeah, I was trying to figure out how I got assigned it, and I realized, I took an elective on Soviet history from a history teacher who'd just gotten back from getting his master's in Soviet history. So you're right. There was a particular moment we were zoomed in on, but it's so much more about, encountering your choices and encountering when you're supposed to put yourself out to pasture. And if that's the truest thing truest act you can make in harmony with the values you've espoused your whole life. And it's this very different. Yeah. It's much less a political story. I mean, it's obviously framed by the political reality of that period.
That's why I laughed when Michael Lessie, when I recorded with him a few months ago, he was a creative nonfiction or literary journalism teacher at Hampshire. And he told me about the 24-hour audition that he would give for all of his students, where they had to write, if I knew then what I know now. They had to do an essay in 24 hours, and he would decide whether they could be in the class based on that. And I burst out laughing. He's like, "What do you mean?" I'm like, "They're 18 years old. They don't know anything then either." He just didn't think that was funny. I'm like, "No, I thought you were being ironic with what I knew then and now." Like, well, what's a 14-year-old versus an 18-year-old? Really? No, that's that different. But
not a big delta between then and now when you're that age.
Yeah. We think we know an awful lot more, but at 50, we can look back at 18 or 14 and see things a little differently, I guess. But
surely the act of surely demonstrating that you have the ability to look inward, even on that small a scale.
Oh yeah,
must be.
I appreciate where he was coming from, but it was still just the laugh of an 18-year-old, with wisdom that their younger self should have had. But.
And that's honestly I go back and forth on this. Is it this, Lear, things in literature are closed to you until you get to be a certain age and you've had certain experiences? Is it because you haven't had those experiences yet, or because you don't have the self-reflect, the ability to look inward, the ability to self-awareness?
Yeah. Well, again, it's our ongoing conundrum. It hit me in I was reading Travels with My Aunt by Graham Greene over the last couple of nights on my Kindle. And he had this quote, one's life is more formed, I sometimes think, by books than by human beings. It is out of books one learns about love and pain at second hand, which I took as worth writing down. It's a character who, he's a young retiree who has not really lived and gets dragged into this international espionage world, but, or at least international intrigue. But, it's that question of when we think we know something and how stupid we are. I was thinking of it in relation to The Watchmen a couple of days ago, how the various stages of my life in which lead character I fixated on or identified with at different points. When I was a alienated teen, of course, you identify with Rorschach. Mm-hmm. And when I was this techno bizarro mystic, Dr. Manhattan made all the sense in the world. And as I became a middle-aged man who dresses up in tights, the night owl sort of made more sense to me. I just thought of the funny thing is at no point in my life has Ozymandias ever been.
Ever, right.
Yeah. It's like, well, at least there's not that, or the comedian, but, those are the two characters I've managed not to identify with over the years. But
comedian's so much of our parents' generation in some very real way. Like he always was the old man to me. And I, of course, dreaded becoming Dan Dreiberg. I could see that coming very far off. It was for a 15-year-old kid, it's an exposure to a kind of mortality. Realize you could turn out like this guy.
But then you realize that's the most human character in the entire book.
Absolutely.
Is the guy who,
no question,
just kind of making his way through here, and he'll never have those glory days again. And yeah. But
and doing all right anyway.
Yeah. Not that I spend my time reading superhero comics that you need to know of, but
but no, that's a significant, milestone.
It was a touchstone for us over the years. That was
exactly. It's worth returning to, no question. It brings me up. It reminds me of when we spoke last year. At the time, you were reading a bunch of books, not about dying per se, but by people who were dying and were unlikely to survive. And also, someone had just sent you Murakami's, what I talk about when I talk about running, that was on your shelf to read as well. I was wondering, if
I kept up, and that was part of the Yom Kippur thing that I was referring to. On Yom Kippur, I read books by people written when they were dying, which has started the previous year, as we mentioned. And this time around, it was Gratitude by Oliver Sacks, which I think he got his diagnosis, and they're just a collection of small essays. And somebody had turned me on in recent months to Intoxicated by My Illness by Anatole Broyard, who died of prostate cancer. Mm-hmm. And a couple of essays, a short story he wrote years earlier about hospitalization and all that, and then his final notes before he died. And the notes are phenomenal. He was clearly heading towards something through his understanding of dying that in my fasting, caffeine-addled, dehydrated state really meant a lot to me, seemingly. And it was really affecting, I suppose, more so than the Sacks. Sacks, the gratitude aspect felt like a sort of valedictory, that at least, he was celebrating everything he got to live. Mm-hmm. Even with the alienation from his parents when he came out and everything else in his life. That at least he got to find, love and find a family and find, a world of his own. But it was the two of those plus 400 pages of Jim Woodring's Frank comics that really seemed to melt my brain over that fast period, along with a couple of naps and
that's unwise. That's just not. Yeah, that's not safe. That's
no, it wasn't. And I woke up the next morning again having obviously I need to get on a plane and go out to Columbus, Ohio. but yeah, it was, but I've kept up that, and I have a stack of these things. And when I was in London, right before my Frankfurt business trip, I met with Celia Paul, one of the people I've recorded with in recent years. We did 2 remote ones. We were going to get together just to hang out in person. And she's one of the people I tried to talk through my whole thing. We had a few hours together, and I figured I should just unload from the 2 or 3 weeks earlier the whole story, even though, again, in the process, things were changing. And she sent me afterwards a copy of Roland Barthes' morning diary. After his mother died, all the diary he kept before he strolled out in front of a truck and got killed, or killed himself, which I haven't started yet, but that's set for next Yom Kippur if I make it there, I guess. But yeah, the sense of what people who really know they're on the way out, what they write then, what they want to be remembered for, I guess. It's something.
Are you reading that in congruence with your experience of feeling like you'd started to strip away what doesn't matter? You know, do you feel in general that account of life, is that zeroing in?
In a sense, yeah. Or seeing what other people zero in on.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You know, that they each had their own. Hitchens had his own thing. Harold Brodkey, sheathed in lies, had his own thing. Everybody had different ways once they knew. I mean, in that, and I've talked about it, in that 10-day stretch before I got my diagnosis, I started working on an obit and thought about what I've really done and haven't done and what remained. And seeing people who did know and were much more accomplished writers, work through what they wanted to get down in those last months. And not knowing how much time they had in some cases. Again, Hitchens went too early. Or went earlier than he expected. He lost his faculties earlier than he expected, had too many hospitalizations. And other guys, they had different time frames attached to their departures, I guess, their deaths. It was hit on recently. Another former guest of mine, or past guest of mine, died, and I put together a side page for the main web podcast page of guests who have passed and the dates when they died. And of 12 so far, 3 of them died this year. And, it's a tendency that I record with older people generally, so that's going to happen. But it hit me that the earliest one was a guy named D.G. Myers. I recorded with in 2014 in springtime. I knew he had prostate cancer. It had recurred. He knew he was on the way out, thought he had 2 years left to live, was working on a book about the whole experience, dead 6 months later. Didn't get 24 months like he thought. And that was the first time a guest of mine had died. And that was this, even when you have a general sense of this and a prognosis, it doesn't mean anything. You need to take care of what you need to take care of sooner rather than later. You just don't know what's left, I suppose. And then someone like Tom dies instantly at 50-ish. You just don't know. But anyway, that's all the depressing stuff where we could just go on and on about. Ask cheerier questions.
It's really true. Well, turning it to, I guess, and this is really the last thing I'll sort of check in on from last year, but this encounter, I know you talked about it as realizing, I made all these attempts to control everything, and my hands just have never really been on the wheel. And someone, I think you called them a lapsed Buddhist, had said, well, the next step is understanding that there is no wheel. And I just kind of wanted to revisit that and see where you found yourself with that next evolution.
I always try and exert control, but there's no control. Even this diagnosis, even the COVID that I've got now, I knew going into it, I'm like, I am son of a bitch. These clients of mine want to meet in Bryant Park right before Christmas. I mean, what the hell are they thinking? If we had an out of the way restaurant, something. So I went in knowing this is not going to be good. But afterwards, instead of taking the subway back to 96th Street and racing home to try to avoid the traffic, I thought, I'm just going to walk around New York for a few hours. I'm just going to take in what I take in and see whatever there is to see. Because, again, as usual, who knows when I'm going to be back in and who knows when I'm going to have time, and let the experience, open up for you. And I wrote about it in last week's email that of all bizarre moments, I happened to walk by this couple sitting on a park bench in Central Park. I coming up this little winding path, and the man is closer to me, and he's got his back to me, and so they're kind of obscured. And I see the woman's face sort of over his shoulder, and I think she's crying, and I'm not sure what's going on. I keep walking past, and I look over, and she is crying, and she's looking down at her hand at this ring that she is wearing for the first fucking time. And the guy is fucking beaming. And I'm looking over, I'm like, they're having the happiest goddamn moment of their life. This is absolute joy. And I got to see it. I got to see the look on both of their faces. And yeah, a couple of days later, I am knocked the fuck out with COVID. Everything is shitty and run down. But I thought, at least I got to see those two people in that moment of millions and millions of people around. They were the two most beautiful people in the world in just that instant. So yeah, I don't know what point there is to any of that, but it's the dangers there, the things we can't control are there, but just trying to stay open somewhat to seeing the world or seeing the people around you, I guess.
Yeah, allowing
because I
that
spent so many
moment.
years just sitting in this house in the woods.
Right.
So,
and allowing that moment to find you. And it runs counter to the notion of these touchstones and these milestones that we're expecting to measure our life by. But that was kind of the next more positive spin I wanted to put on the longer, this longer life conversation. What are other touchstones that you do find yourself returning to again and again and again, whether it be literarily or whether it be artistically or whether it be some other kind of event in your life?
I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, you go back to certain movies. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of things that we liked when we were young that are problematic in certain ways, and you still measure yourself, against some of those reactions. But at the same time, it's like, wow, that is some racist or sexist or whatever stuff that I wasn't quite cognizant of when I was young. One of the weird things is just with art making these last couple of years, returning to people I drew. I go to the site, onthisday.com. Mm-hmm. If I haven't drawn anything, sometimes I'll look and just see who was born or who died on whichever day and maybe try and draw them. And now it's been long enough that I'm coming across the same people and thinking, I could try and draw this person again. I bet it'll come out a lot better than it did the first time. And usually using a different photo and such. But, finding that sort of change, marking myself against some of those improvements. And I don't know, art is a weird technical thing too, but there are things I've gotten better at doing that mean something to me. But yeah, as far as books to go back to, or, the essays, sometimes you almost fall into a sort of familiarity or comfort zone with those as opposed to really feeling yourself against them. And that's been an issue. I started out this past year, 2022, returned to a couple of books that I'd read in years past. Mrs. Dalloway, Invisible Cities, and The Good Soldier by Ford Madox Ford. And they were good, but even at the time, well, Mrs. Dalloway worked for me a lot better than the first time that I'd read it because I was an idiot the first time. The other two liked, but they just didn't click, I suppose, didn't resonate in certain ways that did something for me. I'll tell you what the different thing was, and I'm sure it was this past year. I went to the Frick, which is temporarily relocated in the old Whitney location. The Frick Museum is relocated where the Whitney is on Madison Ave. And they took all the paintings, and they are in this bizarre modernist Whitney building now. And paintings that I'd looked at again and again in the Frick environment are completely different when they're in this much more darkened, showroomy, gallery-esque vibe that the Whitney has. The ones that I particularly loathed in the original Frick museums, the Fragonards, because they're in this just garishly
super
French,
Rococo, yeah.
Oh, awful pale blue carpet, all this grotesquerie. They're just hanging on their own in these like dark brown metal, rooms in such a concrete. And it's like, oh, those paintings actually work really fucking well. Just, yeah, they are just
a window
not
then
served
instead of part of this already out of hand environment. You're looking through this blank wall into another space.
So yeah, taking them away, putting them in different contexts. They have the Rembrandt self-portrait there that I love. Some of the Goyas and things I looked at differently, seeing them in a different environment. But I was also a different person. I hadn't seen those paintings since I'd started drawing myself. So seeing them now, I look at them differently. That might be one of the bigger changes as opposed to literature. There are essays I go back to. There are things that I'm still discovering and learning from. I talked about it in the guest list episode. One of the great experiences for me was just reading Donald Hall's essays about meeting a bunch of his poet precursors, like Eliot Pound and Marianne Moore and people like that. Particularly the Pound encounter, where Pound is a shattered wreck of a human being at that point, and Hall is trying to wrestle him into a Paris Review interview mode. That was meaningful to me, more meaningful than maybe going back and reading Philip Roth's Everyman, which I used to do every year. I might still do on New Year's Eve. I've got a few days to decide, but I've got to see which things, turn out to matter as much to go back to, I suppose.
I certainly, understand the difficulty of balancing the security of the reruns, the security of going back to things that are familiar and comfortable and bring you back to good places in your life without really truly re-encountering them. And so actually the most productive times I've had trying to do those revisitings have actually been with poetry.
Yeah.
I've actually been going back to particular collections, particularly things I was assigned. That's another good one, is to go back to things that you've been assigned and were ruined for you the first time out. But poetry seems to support that for me a lot better, because there isn't the same sense of security and in that relationship, I think.
That could be. I mean, for me, as I've talked about before, I'm a poetry moron. So I've always got every year when I finish the guest list episode and talk about what I'm going to read the next year, it's always more poetry, and I never read more poetry. But I've got the at least temporary impetus of my coincidentally bumping into Emily Dickinson's grave back in November when I was recording with Michael Lessie up in Amherst and Northampton.
How does that sneak up on you? I mean,
well, that was one of those moments where I finished recording with Michael, and I got up at 3:30 in the morning to drive up to Amherst to record with him, and walked around my old campus for a while and drove into town. And I was just walking down Main Street in town and glanced over, and I saw these old graves off to the side where this condo is right in front of me, and there's a little strip mall to my right, but in between there's this parking lot behind there, then a bunch of graves. And I thought, I'll go back there. I got my pad with me. Maybe I'll sketch some of these things. And I walk over, and they're old graves. And I see this big, entryway plaque, explaining West Cemetery in Amherst and, where Emily Dickinson is buried. And here's the map. Here's a legend. And I was like, fuck. I mean, I lived here for 3.5 years.
That's what startles me.
Because I didn't give a shit. And I was sexist, so I didn't read, poetry, especially by women. And those things didn't matter, because it's the same thing as never even thinking of taking Lessie's class back when I was at Hampshire. Literary journalism. What's that? I'm going to be a great novelist. I don't need this. Now I realize, that would have been a really great course for me to take, or at least to try. If only I could have known then what I know now. But I walked over, I found her grave, which is like fenced. There's a metal or an iron fence maybe 6 inches away from the tombstone, so you cannot get a picture that actually captures it because there's no way to get like between the grave and the gravestone and the fence. I sat there for a few moments and just thought about all the opportunities like that I'd missed. That was from 19 to 21. And at that point, I'll be 52 in a couple of weeks. And what other things that I did not even keep my eyes open and see? And this is all, like I say, this weird fall for me. This was from mid-October up until last week. You know, all these things just keep opening up in ways that maybe hadn't, at least during the pandemic years, if not longer. That, I should walk over there and, hey, there's some graves. I should take a look at that. And, oh, hey, this turns out to be one of the more significant things out there. So when I left Amherst, went over to Northampton, I picked up a copy of Dickinson's poems thinking, yeah, I'll sit down and start reading her next year. And maybe it'll be more meaningful that I saw this and that I was such a moron that I didn't care about it back when I was in college.
The thing that did it for me was the breakthrough for me in trying to properly encounter poetry was just not caring whether I was an idiot about it. I have a bunch of poetry books and a number of collections. I just throw them open and start reading. And if something catches my soul in some way, then I go find more of that. But I really don't try to have any sophisticated approach, any kind of anything other than just the most naive encounter, I guess.
Sure. Well, this falls into the other...
really self-conscious about that too when I try to read poetry, no question.
Well, the thing, though, to understand is for me, even though I say, numbers don't matter, et cetera, I still have to keep the list of every book that I've finished since 1989, and poems aren't going to count. So why should I bother reading poems when I can finish, Oliver Sacks's, 80-page book and count that as because a recording angel is going to give a fuck. That's what matters. So yeah, it's getting over that after all these years. Just letting something be the thing by itself and not have to be part of some metric or some spreadsheet as we know it. That'll be the next great achievement and transformation in my life, I suppose.
And I also want to take a moment and be fair to the 19 to 21-year-old.
No, he was a dick.
Well, but yeah, we all were. We all were dicks then, obviously. Yeah. But what I mean is that, we didn't miss out on all of these experiences only because we were too cool to have them. We had shit we were focused on, man. We had shit we cared about. We had shit we really wanted to look at and encounter. Because I was thinking about this with you talking about having seen the return to paintings that you knew from the Frick. I had a similar encounter when I went back to DC for the first time in forever. I went to look for a particular painting that I always visited, Cezanne's on the River Marne. And it was in the last year of Obama's presidency, and the son of a bitch had it in the White House. I went to where it should have been hanging. There was a little plaque there saying this Cezanne is currently in the hands of our president and first lady. I was like, oh man. But the other thing that happened that trip was that I went to the monuments for the first time, and I don't remember ever consciously when I lived there and went into, when I lived in the area, went into DC every 3 weeks, every 6 weeks. I was in there a lot. I never got around to the monuments, not specifically because I turned my nose up at them, but I just had too much other stuff I wanted to do. I wanted to personally know every painting in both wings of the National Gallery. There was stuff I wanted to see and do every single time I went there, and I was hungry for. Again, glad I waited, because the encounter that I had with the actual monuments was also something I wasn't capable of. Sure. When I was younger, particularly the encountering both the Lincoln Monument and then the Jefferson Memorial together, and realizing that the Lincoln is a temple to Zeus, and the Jefferson is this Delphic. It's a temple to Apollo. And you could feel it in the spaces, and you could feel that this is getting very, very out of track. All I meant was that let's not forget that we also overlooked things that seemed mundane to us because we were hungry for particular things and passionate about particular things.
But a lot of it was also, comic books. So there were still things I should have focused better on. But again, we only had the one life, no control group against it. So. Yeah. Okay, here's that 20-minute gap where we talked about comics and comic book movies and nostalgia, pop music, and other stuff, like the embarrassing things I asked my Amazon Echo to play. We both agreed after that the whole segment didn't work, so I cut it. I'll blame COVID.
And I don't know if it's as true in the world of letters. That's actually an interesting question that might actually return us to the written word in short order. But I noticed when I was back trying out being an undergrad again in 2007 that the 18-year-olds, the 18 to 20-year-olds were incredibly musically literate. If they were interested in music, that is. They were incredibly musically literate because if they heard that there was an interesting thing happened for 3 years in structuralist Albanian solo viola, they could go find that entire corpus and that entire movement and sample it in an hour. Whereas we were constrained by our ability to get a hold of the physical artifact, to afford it, or at least to find somebody who had it and borrow it. And not even knowing artifact to artifact how much of the movement that represented.
What's interesting though, and this is, I think, one of the other readings I did on Yom Kippur. It was the introduction to Nothing If Not Critical by Robert Hughes, the Australian art critic. Mm-hmm. And for him, growing up in the, I'd say 50s in Australia, maybe 40s in Australia, there was no art. They had, the art by locals. They had some Aboriginal art, but it wasn't really appreciated. But like great artworks, all they had were how they were written about in art critic magazines that took months to show up in Australia.
Right.
And that's all they educated themselves on. Museums weren't traveling. Guys weren't sending, works to Australia at that point. Mm-hmm. So he basically became an art critic from these little bad black and white halftone reproductions in these magazines and the descriptions of them. And that was all he had to go on until he finally got to Europe and start seeing the great works. But imagine that, like you're building an entire critical framework where all you've got, it's like a Borges story. All you have are the references
it's
to the artwork. And you never get to encounter it in any meaningful way, but decide to devote your life to it anyway. Yeah, it's some ill shit. It's really amazing. And you can take or leave what you think of Hughes as a critic and blah, blah, blah. But the idea that that was the upbringing, that once upon a time, again, we talk about pre-internet, but this is like, it's one thing to be pre-internet living 25 miles from New York City. Mm-hmm. It's another thing to be living, 10,000 miles from New York City at 7,000 miles from Paris and anywhere else and not being able to see any of the art that's going to define your life.
And it's the closest thing I think you can get to that cliched, we don't, as modern people who are assaulted by image all the time, don't get what it must have been like in the late medieval period to walk into one of these cathedrals and see that kind of vision and that kind of, just things were not represented in your daily life that way. And to walk in and look up at this ceiling that's, he must have felt some of that same.
Yeah. This whole thing is you knew you knew they existed because somebody was writing about them, but you didn't know what they really meant, what it looked like. And of course you didn't know what color was. Mm-hmm.
That's the craziest part to me. That's absolutely the craziest part.
Yeah. Everything was just these black and white repros in these like 1950s art journals. And he and the small coterie of people were just devoted to it, but didn't know what the art was, and finally, made it their lives.
Wow. I mean, when I first got into art criticism, I was made very aware, hey, you have to, if you can't go to see it in person, you got to be very careful about which repros you see and what imprints are reputable in that way, and compare a number repros, and also that, the things you're not going to appreciate from the scale or from the color. And I got to tell you, I even knew that was supposed to happen. And when I went to the Tate and walked into the Turner wing, I really got Turner in a way that I just never did.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
And knew I shouldn't be surprised that experience was going to happen, but it still really, really did. But I understand this phenomenon. I was still not prepared for when it really hit me. How out of sync, out of touch I could be about that.
Yeah, the ones at the Frick were like that too. Nice to see them on a screen, but until you see the harbor and the sun, it's just not the same. Well, this was, and again, this ties into the London trip. I got to see the big Lucian Freud exhibition at the National Gallery, and then go a day or two later to see Celia Paul, who had a relationship with Freud, and we sort of talked through my response to his work and hers, because she's one of the figures that he painted in the collection that's there. I mean, and Freud from the reproductions, but until you see it in person, especially once he hits that stage of his career, you don't get what he's doing with the paint, as I didn't. And I said to her, I'm like, and I said, I know this is not a profound observation. I said, but he's degrading both the subject and the material. the material itself is degraded in his hands. It's all bubbling and rotting away off the top while he's rendering this flesh to the point of hideousness almost. And she thought, well, she at least humored me and pretended that was a profound observation.
It doesn't have to be profound. It was a profound experience.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to
The
be.
nice thing was going from that to the Winslow Homer exhibition that was there too, and just taking in some of there's stuff there that's absolutely beautiful, and the watercolors from Nassau, which I did a watercolor of one of. Seeing those was really, really affecting, but it was nice to go from one to the other and then see the rest of the National Gallery stuff. But yeah, it was seeing those things. Nothing will prepare you for that moment. Again, the digital only takes us so far, which is the irony of doing this, of course. But
well, that was sort of the thrust of the question I was inclining toward. Given this ability to survey for purposes of literacy, visual art or visual arts or music that was mostly contained to specific personal experience, and now you have access to much bigger hunks of it and can consume it in a broader with a broader perspective. Do you think the same thing has happened in the world of the written word? That has the increased access allowed a broader purview for an individual reader, allowed them to be kind of literate or experienced in a way that you weren't able to when we were younger?
I don't think so. I mean, my initial reaction is going back to the recognitions, for example. It took me a guy at a bookstore in Amherst to recommend William Gaddis to me. Now, that guy knew from something else I was buying that you probably really dig the recognitions, man. And when I finally found it, there's no shortcut. You had to read 740 pages of, or however long it is, might be longer, of that book about sort of the history of art and art criticism and what it takes to make art. And there is no quotation marks, or you're figuring out the dialogue on the fly. If anything, it's more difficult on a Kindle or an e-reader than it is, on the written page, a printed page. So it would feel like the universal jukebox gives you access to that stuff, but it doesn't give you still have to invest the time in a way that's different than
of having to actually go through it. Because the experiences I was comparing it to also are momentary, not just from a skip standpoint, but I'm talking about a 3 to 5 minute song. I'm talking about a single painting that you'd stand in front of for minutes and minutes, but unlikely hours. You certainly wouldn't have to. to have viewed the painting. You wouldn't have to look at it for an hour to see the whole painting. Yeah, I think the thing that's kind of a cutting, I'm going to say, double-edged. For me, as a digital reader, I have many. I mean, it's always going to be true that I have more books than I can read, but I have many more books on my Kindle than I can read. And on the one hand, yeah, that's just adding to the tower of, to the unscalable tower. But also there's a better chance that something might connect with me in an arbitrary or an unpredictable way. That is to say, I could find, I could just cross over. I could intersect with something that it turns out I'm in the mood or the right place for, because I do have a kind of random access moment, at least as a gatekeeper to my reading habits.
Oh, sure. And that's the story of the guest list episode where I finished with my favorite books that I read this past year. Under no other circumstance would I have finally started reading Against the Day by Thomas Pynchon if it weren't on my Kindle and it weren't like $2.99 once. I had a hard copy of it. That's 1,054 pages.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna hold that book physically to read that much. Yes. But 10 to 15 pages a night, I figured 3-4 months, I'll get through that. And it turned out to be this wonderful, wonderful experience. One that I'm having difficulty recapturing what it felt like to be inside that book. Mm-hmm. Once it was done, I was struggling to find another experience that would replicate that sense of being in a world, not necessarily that particular one that he built. There are multiple worlds that he builds in that book, but that sense of being in an imaginative consciousness like that. Mm-hmm. Again, which you don't get in a short form experience. It's one that takes a lot of willingness and a lot of commitment to go into.
Put in the miles. Got to put in the miles.
Yeah. And, it was absolutely wonderful. And as I said in that episode, I'll never give a copy of that away as a gift to someone because all they're going to do is think I'm being a snooty asshole or something.
Right. It's like buying somebody a subscription to the New Yorker. It's just, come on, that's just me.
Yeah, congratulations. Let this pile up in your bathroom for a while.
Exactly. That's not only am I smarter than you, I actually just pranked you. It's both sticks at the same time. Well, I think where I've landed on a lot of the stuff we've touched on as far as the arc of living in the moment and mortality and what do you have control and what don't you, and is all the old better, new better, and what's it worth encountering the past self is I've noticed. I think the best example of sort of where I've landed at my particular age is with one of those paperbacks that I pulled out and loved the smell of and loved sitting down and reading. I also grabbed it from the library on the Kindle, and I went back and forth. I annotated a little bit on the iPad. I made it part of my doing the crossword sitting down experience on the particular device that I had, but also sometimes I read it I went back and forth and very productively went back and forth across those borders, which was kind of a new experience to me. And the notion of blending those and selecting the right tool for the job feels like I don't know, a kind of maturity. And so I ask if you're feeling in that kind of space or where you're arriving as you find balance at our age.
Again, the right books strike at the right times. Other books, you know how much I read for the show. You know how much I'm trying to stay ahead. And, there's always the sense of, there should be the extracurricular life. Again, the Pynchon, we'll say it's extracurricular because there's no way I'll sit down with him. Salman Rushdie's memoir, things like that are not for the show, but keep my reading life alive. But yeah, knowing how to balance there are books that I bought, as you've said, you buy the digital and the analog and just flip back and forth between them. I did that with the Pynchon book. The last 80 or so pages I read in print, sitting downstairs in my Eames chair with less than 100 pages left. Maybe I'll just start now. And then 2 hours later, it's, oh my God, it's over. You read in different formats and with different eyes, I suppose.
And I do love not, being able to tape over the progress bar in a Kindle and actually not knowing how many pages you have left in a novel that, in a book that has an ending of some kind. And I used to really bug me to know how many pages were left and how they were going to have to wrap it up in X number of linear feet.
Oh no, I had the great experience once with an Elmore Leonard book that I didn't realize had all this supplemental stuff in the digital version. So I was at the 70-something% mark, and I'm like, Jesus, how are they going to pad this out? And then it ended. I'm like, it was an interview, and there's this and that. That's taken up another 25% of this book. Okay, that's I was completely misled by, all the bonus material in the back. So, yeah. So I've learned to just make it you set it to how many minutes are left in the chapter or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. So, But yeah, I should ask though, in the keeping with the guest list vibe, mm-hmm. who are you hoping to read in 2023? Do you have any reading goals or plans?
I'm hoping to read in another language this year.
Yeah.
I'm hoping to read in German, and I have, as I've been unpacking, have sequestered all of my Latin textbooks, and I'm going to pick up Latin again. I'm going to try to read hunks of the Aeneid in Latin as a caution. When I was learning Latin at the university level, particularly in the Latin boot camp that you do over the summer, like you did the Greek intensive when you went to St. John's, when we met, we found ourselves asking a lot. So it sounds like you've hit upon, if not a rule, a guideline. Like, should we expect to see it work that way all the time? And inevitably, we would ask that kind of question. No matter what professor, TA, or grad student it was, they all would say, "Oh yeah, no, that's all." No, wait, no, not in Virgil. Other than that, yeah, you'll see it that way all the time. But no, Virgil doesn't do that. So I've been excited about trying to read, but it's a stupid, crazy idea for me to try to pick up. That's my main reading goal, is to actually read in another language for the first time.
As everything in my life reminds me of, a podcast I recorded. It reminds me of sitting down with Marina Warner right after sitting with Celia in London. Marina and I recorded, and I forget what the context was, but I just remembered, to me, one of the funniest passages of all of ancient literature when Camilla's father saves her in the Aeneid when they're being chased by brigands or whoever, by tying his infant daughter to a spear and throwing it across the river. She goes sailing through the air, attached to the spear, lands on the other side. He's killed, but she's safe because she's on the other side of the river and gets raised and becomes this great warrior queen and all that. But yeah, the moment I read, because I got to the Aeneid very late, because coming from St. John's, especially on the graduate side, we were very Greek oriented and gave short shrift to the Romans. Sure. And so I always stupidly held Virgil in derision because Homer was all that. Mm-hmm. Finally read him and thought, oh, okay, no, I get why this is different. Not necessarily better, but, I get why he's going in a different direction, what he's trying to accomplish here. This is actually something amazing, not just Kobe trying to imitate Mike.
Right.
But,
which is absolutely how it struck us when we were punk teenagers. I mean, in fairness, that's really true.
And I just carried that for like 20 more years until I finally sat down with it, and I'm like, oh yeah, no, the Romans did have something to offer. It wasn't just a carbon copy or, degraded copy of the Greeks. But
it's honestly one of the reasons I've kind of wanted to try out some of it in the original Latin. With the Iliad, we had at least the two poles of Lattimore and Fitzgerald, but I don't know that I've read another Aeneid other than Fitzgerald. So again, there it was an easy trap to fall into, to say, oh, that the great thing about Fitz's Odyssey and the great thing about Fitz's Aeneid must mean that one is derivative of the other, if he's so good at translating them both, if his is the right translation for both. I also would say, as advice, my friend Alec Berlin was in town a number of years ago. He's a Broadway guitarist on Broadway, and plays orchestra stuff on Broadway. And he and I went guitar shopping, and we went to somebody's garage. When you go to a music store to look at guitars, there's usually a corner, depending on how good the music store is, of stuff that is up behind the counter they don't want you to touch. And the size of that corner has something to do with the quality, perhaps, of the store from a guitar standpoint. This garage was all that corner. It was a garage and his basement. And what had become clear was, this is one of those things when a collection takes on a life of its own and becomes a kind of functioning business, or at least a functioning avocation, that blurs the lines between enjoyment and a life's work in some way. It's purely recreational and purposeful life's work stuff. And I would propose that perhaps that line may have permanently blurred for you, which is probably okay.
Yeah, I mean, there is no sense of who I am without the show.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Between the relationships I've built and just the humanity I've learned to mimic through interacting with so many people. No, the person I've become, the better human being I've become through talking to so many people, mm-hmm. and the support so many people have shown me. That is the thing that, of course, fills me with shame, but also a sense of love and admiration. That doesn't exist if I'm just. It exists in a very limited sense with the the pharma people in my life and mm-hmm. the friends who I just wasn't keeping in touch with enough in my life otherwise. But the thing we didn't talk about, and you have to split in a couple of minutes. Just doing the 500th episode and just getting commentaries or just getting comments and mm-hmm. a song from two songs, as a matter of fact, from so many past guests, and just having this I'll just say celebration of what we've built as reader, as showmaker, guest, and listener. What it's really meant is something, I guess, and made me feel like I felt when I was first in the interzone of not knowing what my cancer thing was going to be. Mm-hmm. The sense of like, I built something worthwhile. Mm-hmm. I managed to create something that, if I'm gone, people will discover some of these conversations and have these, it was a really good talk with, this person or that person. And, this guy was actually good at getting people to talk about parts of their life and their art that they maybe didn't talk about in other interviews or conversations.
Well, it struck me because I heard you sort of say, well, there are things I read, even though I know I would never get them as a guest. And there's a point at which, when you've found your purpose, everything you do and everything you read is both explicitly for the work and for itself. That reading someone that you're never going to get as a guest prepares you for the other guests, or it sustains your life as a reader. That at some point when you've found the thing, I'm told, those two, that inside and that outside, that distinction between the work and the identity of the life just gets blurred. I think it just goes away. I'm all about blurriness, and that's what I heard. Maybe
it's part of the COVID talking, but
yeah, it's funny. When I was reviewing the last episode, I was just trying to skip through it as fast as I could, and I kept forgetting whether or not I had actually sped it up. We were going so fast. Just at our normal pace, we were going so fast. I wonder if people are going to think, have I accidentally left the speed at 0.75? Am I playing back the slower speed, given what I listened to last year?
Yeah. Both of us are during and post-COVID right now. So, yeah, we're a little slow and a year older. So
yeah. I'm a lot. Yeah, a lot more than a year older. A lot more than a year older, but in a very good way. I'm tired, but I'm tired in a good way right now. So,
and again, next December, we'll see, what shape we're both in.
Absolutely. Well, as ever, a pleasure to revisit with you. As I found it good to talk about what it's like to revisit milestones, because that's always what it's like to talk to you. Evaluate whether or not those touchstones are worth it, and whether or not, both to remember and to reevaluate is always really good. So
we'll find out what you read what you read in translation of your own next year.
Sounds great.
And that was me. Many thanks again to Aaron Finkelstein for taking on the role of interviewer. Aaron is not active on Twitter. I have no idea if he's on Facebook, but he does post photos on Instagram sometimes as A.K. Finkelstein, which is A.K.Finkelstein. I'll have a link to that in the show and episode notes for this one. He's also got a Bandcamp account with some of his music, but he has not given me a link to that, so I can't share that with you. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show by telling people about it. Let them know there's this guy who, even in the midst of COVID, is putting out really interesting conversations every week with, people more interesting than him, frankly. You can also help out the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it, or who you want to hear me record with, or what movie or TV show or book or piece of music or art exhibition or theater or whatever you think I should check out or turn listeners on to. You can do that by sending me a postcard or a letter or an email, or by leaving a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me. And messages can be up to 3 minutes long. So if you're going to go over that, just call back and leave a second message. And let me know if it's okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might have something neat that we'd love to share with the listeners, but I would never do that without your permission. So let me know. Now, if you've got money or other resources to spare, don't give it to me. Although I am starting a Substack this month, moving my weekly email over to that and doing some bonus stuff, and we'll see where it all goes. But really, if you have money to spare, give it to people or institutions in need. You can find people through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Crowdfunder, other crowdfunding platforms. And if you're looking for somewhere to start with institutions or foundations, you can look to your local food bank. It's what I give to the Poor People's Campaign, Freedom Funds, Election Funds, Planned Parenthood and Women's Choice Funds. There are a lot of things you can do to try to help build a better world. So I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us.
It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.